Hey folks, greetings and welcome along to the New Zealand Tech Podcast. This is officially our out of lockdown episode, I guess you could say. Fully out of lockdown at level 1, aren't we, Bill? We're pretty much, this is back to normal.
As of last night, yes.
Yeah. So thanks everybody for joining us on the show. We're at episode 492 and our guest today is Bill Bennett. Awesome to have you back in the studio, Bill.
Hi, Paul. Good to be here. Nice to be out and about again.
Yeah, we're really there at level 1. Very encouraging, and also a big thank you to our show partners: Sumo Logic, Vodafone New Zealand, Spark New Zealand, Vocus, HP, Samsung, and of course Gorilla Technology, our founding sponsor. So great to have those partners, and look, really appreciate their support of the New Zealand Tech Podcast, and of course of the entire tech ecosystem in New Zealand. Now, Bill, loads to talk about, but the headline that really caught my attention, which I thought was fascinating to see, is Slack partnering up with Amazon to take on Microsoft Teams, because Slack have, I guess as long as Microsoft Teams has been around, and even before Microsoft Teams launched, Slack were sort of saying, welcome. They welcomed them with a big, advert in the New York Times. But along the way, they've been saying Microsoft is not a competitor. But now we've got this news that Slack are partnering up with Amazon, who have their own video platform. I mean, maybe the other option would have been Zoom. It was kind of, either of those could have been potential partnerships, but
Zoom's the name
quite
of the hour, isn't it?
Quite different.
Yeah.
I can imagine a partnership with Amazon. There was maybe a bit more in terms of what both companies would ultimately get out of such a partnership. Certainly for Amazon, with Amazon Chime, which is just not a name that you hear too often, and it's the same with their competitors to their whole sort of compete with G Suite and with Microsoft 365, which they do to a degree have products in that place in terms of email, of course, Chime with the video conferencing, video calling capability, and even compete with Microsoft Word Online and Google Docs and so on. So this will be very interesting to actually see how it plays out. It's hard to know what that partnership looks like behind the scenes.
Well, yeah. I mean, it's interesting. You said that Slack started out saying they weren't going to be competing with Teams, but that's not how Microsoft saw it. I think Microsoft positioned themselves very much as being a competitor to Teams Teams being a competitor to Slack from the outset.
Yes.
I think that was always their game.
And to Zoom, and I mean, I guess in both of those areas, they're competing with very dominant players, but they're following that playbook, I think, that Microsoft have used many times to varying degrees, where they will throw a lot of money and a lot of resource at trying to dominate a space. Now, I mean, this is very familiar to me, because in my earlier years in the technology world, in the early 90s, which is where really my career kicked off, there was a big player, Novell, who really dominated in the networking space, and they were the default go-to if you wanted to network together a bunch of computers, being PCs or Macs or a mix, and you were really serious. I mean, certainly within New Zealand, sort of small to medium businesses, Novell NetWear was the go-to, but Microsoft.
It's not a name we've heard for a long time, isn't it?
No, it just slowly disappeared. But Microsoft threw everything at competing, dropping their prices and so on. And that's sort of what we see with Teams, right? And there's almost a little bit of the old playbook of not probably down the antitrust track that they got to with browser bundling with Windows, but effectively Teams is free for many customers
For
because
Shops,
because so many and look, there aren't too many businesses of scale that don't pay for Microsoft Office in some form, and of course now they've made it so compelling that the way to buy Office is part of what was Microsoft Office 365, and is flipping over to just Microsoft 365 branding, and Teams just goes out as that sort of default option. In fact, they were to a degree sort of what's a rude way to say it, shoving it down people's throats, and that you would install 365 and there's Teams popping up on everybody's screens,
that is
right?
Microsoft's playbook. The other thing that Microsoft historically has done, we put aside the whole Azure side of the business for a moment, because that's in a different category, and that, of course, is just doing extraordinarily well. But if we put that aside, Microsoft has had this culture, and I know because back when you were doing the NetWare experience, I was working for a Microsoft customer magazine in Australia called Communicate, and I remember dealing with their marketing department. And what I remember about Microsoft at that time is exactly what you see now: is that the company has this ability to sort of have a laser focus on one area of its business, one product line, and just. It might spend 3 months, it might spend 4-6 months, but it will just laser focus in that particular area for that wee amount of time. But it's enough time for all of Microsoft to have got the message and all their customers to have got the message and for it to work. And it's always had this ability to zoom in and It's always had this ability to have this laser focus on a particular part of its business and do that very well. The other interesting thing about this is some time ago now, Slack had a similar deal going with IBM. Now, back in the 90s, when, again, we go back to the 90s and the NetWare days, then IBM was a name to conjure with. It was the company to be a partner with.
That's right. And I mean, Microsoft were partnered with them before they released, Windows NT. It was OS2 was their partnership with IBM, wasn't it? Yeah.
And the thing was that IBM was that,
and
if you wanted to get into that enterprise space, you had to have some kind of relationship with IBM. Slack still has a relationship with IBM, but the relationship that matters now is Amazon. And the Amazon, Microsoft, AWS, Azure battle is the battle of our era. Really, that's the war that's in the background. It's the one we don't hear about day to day, but that's the one that really matters. It's about getting people onto your side for either one of those two platforms,
and hence why Microsoft are pushing so hard in so many different areas. Hence why they're investing in having a New Zealand data center. They're trying to do these things ahead of Amazon Web Services so that they can steal a bit of a march. And it's proven hard work, but they're doing pretty well.
Well, here's the thing about Microsoft has always known how to compete. But in perhaps the last decade, it's had to learn how to compete when you're coming from behind. And it's good at it. It's good. It knows how to play that game, and it's doing a good job of it. So here's the thing, right? The Slack and Amazon is a very powerful combination, but it just doesn't have the killer power that Microsoft could have. I mean, remember, Microsoft is. The last time I looked, I haven't looked in the last 2 or 3 days, but 2 or 3 days ago I did look, and Microsoft was the world's biggest company again. So. Microsoft knows what it's doing, and to compete with Microsoft, you've got to form a first-rate team. And I would say that Slack has found the right partner here.
Yeah. Oh, look, the flow on here is, I think, good for everybody's customers.
Yeah.
And we look, a year or two out. it will be quite a different landscape in terms of market shares because of the pace at which Microsoft is now on in terms of their growth.
Yeah.
And if Slack weren't making these sort of partnerships and manoeuvres, it'd be a whole lot harder on them. So,
I think if it wasn't making these manoeuvres, Slack would be starting to disappear from the scene. So it's for Slack's fighting for its life. Microsoft's fighting for a bit more territory.
Zoom seem to be doing well. I think they've talked about some incredible numbers, but again, when you step back and look at a longer term picture, it's you could even to a degree compare where G Suite is compared to the Microsoft offering in terms of 365, in that still so many businesses, whether it's a demand from staff or there's whatever the reasons are, they need some Microsoft Office.
Yeah.
Right? And if you need that, you may as well just have that rather than double paying and paying for and it's obviously not the case for every business, but a lot make that decision of, well, why have G Suite and then a stack of Microsoft on top? If we're paying for Microsoft, let's just wrap it all up in Microsoft. Certainly as Microsoft gets there in terms of, and they're doing pretty well now to be fair, gets there in terms of delivering a really good, strong, capable offering.
Look, there was the culture for a while of best of breed. You would mix and match things across the different product lines, and go for the best of breed products. I've always found that you get the real advantages from the things, the integration between things. So if you can stay in the Microsoft world and stay with that Microsoft integration, or if you can stay in the Google world and stay with the Google integration all the way through, that's actually better than jumping between them. And it grates with people that you're in walled gardens or proprietary systems and so on. There's a lot of people that rail against that, and it grates with them. But really, that's not the important battle anymore. The important battle is the integration, and is being, is basically living with one interface, staying in one world. It's so much easier.
There is a school of thought that is still very anti particular companies, Microsoft probably being the one that people love to hate more than anything. What do you think about that approach? The anything but Microsoft approach. I don't probably see it as much now as where we were maybe 5 years ago, because their offerings are strong, because they've embraced open source, and I think that has started to sink in to a degree, but there is still a segment, and I'm sure it will be there amongst our listeners, who just don't trust Microsoft. Look, and would do anything they can to work with any other product other than a Microsoft product.
And I get that. I can get that, right. I can see why people might think that. Microsoft is a rapacious multinational when it comes to, they're a money-making machine. But so is everyone else. All your options are as well. So there's not really, if you've got a problem with Microsoft, it's something that happened 20 years ago. It's probably
time to get over it, is it?
Yeah, it's time to get over it. The thing is they all have their faults. Quite frankly, the Microsofts and the Googles of this world, there are worse things out there. If you happen to have a social media company which aligns with a certain political trend, that's probably worse. So,
that brings us to a topic. So not actually in our agenda, but we were discussing it before we started, and what we saw was an announcement come through late last week from Xero, just sharing some of their data. And we talk a lot about social media and the power that the social media platforms have, how they can manipulate or not manipulate what we see, whether they should or shouldn't be allowing free speech, or whether they should be blocking certain types of content that is just untrue to whatever degree, racist and so on. Now, the announcement from Xero was just them looking at what the data that they collect across working with a very large percentage of New Zealand businesses. I think they've got probably 2/3 to 70% of the market when it comes to accounting software in New Zealand. And we're in this position that we weren't in certainly 15 years ago, where one company sees all this live data about New Zealand's businesses, because so many of us use Xero. And look, for the remainder, most of those will be with the likes of MYOB and other companies, and more those same companies have that live data because it sits in their cloud. So it was just interesting looking for me. I mean, first of all, it was a shock to see some virtually live data saying small business billings. I'll just see if I've got it here. I'm just seeing. Okay, so we have data around job losses in the business sector, but the big one was that Xero were able to report revenue for New Zealand small businesses fell on average 34% in April compared to April 2019, which is huge, shocking, concerning around what that could mean in terms of job losses and closure of business. But the bit that it triggered for me is, hey, they've got all this data. Now, I'm reasonably relaxed around what they will and won't do with that data, but it is a total change from where we used to be with software, where our data could only be seen by us, and nobody else could see it.
Well, here's the thing, right? It's one thing to say New Zealand small businesses have dropped 34% in the month with the pandemic going on. That's actually useful information,
and it's pretty safe to share.
Yeah, and it's nicely aggregated, right? But now, how would you feel, Paul, if say there was a small problem with Gorilla and you were in the news, and Xero said Gorilla Technologies dropped 40% during that month? They're not doing that, of course.
No, and they couldn't to that level. But there's a point in between for anyone that has a whole lot of data. And I mean, we've seen this and reported about it on the New Zealand Tech podcast before. One of them was Fitbit, where Fitbit was publishing some data around where people were going, and suddenly where people were exercising, whatever it was, there was a map, and suddenly they revealed some highly confidential information.
In the military as well.
That's right. So they revealed basically confidential military bases and maybe put lives at risk.
And there's a problem with aggregating data, because if for example, I mean, this is just a hypothetical example, but New Zealand is a small country, and when you get down to small numbers, that means that things start to become identifiable. So if, for example, Xero is to break out numbers, and I'm just making this is just off the top of my head, and it could be nonsense, but ice cream parlours in Westland, there might only be one ice cream parlour in Westland, right? So if it tells you what that's doing, if you're getting breakouts of data, that's it doesn't matter, it's aggregated. Everyone knows that there's one ice cream parlour in Westland. So they have to be really careful how they do that you can't draw those inferences.
Yeah, and fortunately, we haven't seen any issues down that track. But it does trigger those sort of thinkings around there needs to be more and more wisdom around these things. We've seen government who also have access to, probably more so, incredible amounts of data, and government departments on numerous occasions have allowed data to be made accessible that certainly shouldn't be.
Or the other, and I'm not accusing Xero of doing this, but there must be at some point a temptation for a huge customer to come to Xero and say, "We'll give you, X $1 million if you tell us what our competitors are doing. You've got their data." Well, it's not going to happen. It's just not
at that sort of level.
But they have to make sure they have to earn that trust. which they've done so today, and they're not
yeah.
breaking it now, which is good. But it means there's a responsibility on them that I don't think the people working for Xero signed up for when they decided they were going to work for a tech company. They didn't think they'd have to deal with these issues in just the same way that the people that designed and made Facebook didn't realise they were going to be thrust into the centre of political debates. I mean, for heaven's sake, Facebook was designed as a thing to spot hot girls in a university, and I don't think they ever thought that it was going to be used for nation states to commit misinformation campaigns during an election in another country. I don't think anyone had that in their heads.
More of a concern for me. We've obviously had Rod Drury on the show, numerous times, and so on. Are those firms that are a little bit more at the fringes? A new firm that starts up and offers you a VPN to keep your data private, a provider of a encrypted password storage application, and you don't necessarily know who they are. You don't know whether when they tell you that your data is encrypted end to end and they can't get at it, whether that's
this
true.
happened a
right?
couple of days ago with the Brave browser.
Oh yes,
The Brave browser, which makes this big song and dance about your privacy and so on. Turns out that they were selling. I think what were they doing? They were doing something, weren't they?
I think it was they were inserting into the web pages that you visit affiliate links.
Right,
so they must have realised their business model wasn't working, but any link that you click, if there was a way in which they could make a cut on, you're buying something from Amazon, you're buying something from some sort of through some sort of e-commerce channel, they would change that link to actually give them a cut. Now, in most cases, in terms of the impact on the purchaser, there's not necessarily a huge impact, but it's way beyond what you would expect from a trust perspective and didn't line up with their brand at all. Like, that's quite normal. You go to a tech news site, and a lot of them will now do that. If there's a link to go and buy a product from somewhere, they're going to make a cut, but there is a disclosure, and usually there's a separation between the journalism and how that happens. So it's just
Well, to be fair to Brave has fronted up and said, well, we did something wrong. We're not going to do this anymore, and I think that's plausible. And they've owned it. They've owned the error. Yeah. But the thing is, it just shows you just how easy it is to fall into those traps where you do that, and you can destroy your brand as an organisation by doing so. So,
and hence why a Xero that's a big successful business, are very unlikely to ever go anywhere to close to the margins on something like that, because it's now roughly a $10 billion business. Last time I looked,
we still know that if they get out of order, we just give Rod a hard time. And we can do that. But the thing is that there's a whole minefield of facing tech companies, which there wasn't 10, 15 years ago. I mean, 10, 15 years ago, the worst thing that could happen in the tech sector was Microsoft become a monopoly in parts of it with browsers. I think was what everyone was worried about. That's nothing compared with the issues we face today.
Yeah, and Microsoft certainly it's a very different world for them now. Now, another story that I wanted to pick up on, and this is we've talked about online entertainment streaming content for so many years, since the early days of this podcast, when you couldn't get much streaming content at all in New Zealand, and it was, is there a sort of middle ground between just illegal downloads of content and paying for subscriptions with overseas services and using some sort of a proxy or a VPN to get Netflix in New Zealand. Now, we're well past that, but a headline that caught my attention was that Amazon's Prime Video service are going to start giving away some English Premier League games, so basically free streaming. Now,
Yeah.
it's not an across the board, but it just caught my attention, and it's one of my concerns about the impact on us having a local entertainment, businesses like Sky, like Spark Sport here in New Zealand, where a player as big as Amazon could come in, buy up varying rights, and if they wished, they could say, look, come on board, it's going to be $1 a month or it's going to be free. And of course, with a player of that sort of scale, that sort of dominance, I mean, the word would get out, the low price. I mean, virtually any approach that they take, if they come into this market seriously, is likely to have that Netflix-style effect. And, we saw that with Netflix. I don't know the exact numbers, but I remember last time we checked, Netflix was in 5 to 10 times as many homes as the next bit of competition in terms of Lightbox and Neon. And I don't know, I'm mildly concerned.
Right. First thing is the British rights for the English Premier League are a bit complicated anyway. There's 3 different,
and they're a bit expensive.
Yeah, and they're a bit expensive, right? And I think Sky has some. I think it's Sky, BBC, and Amazon but it's certainly 3. There's certainly 3 players, and you have to buy all 3 if you want to watch an entire season. Well, you kind of have to do that a bit here with soccer if you're a soccer fan in New Zealand, because Spark has the Premier League, but Sky has the other football competitions that the Premier League clubs play in, like the FA Cup and the European Championship and so on. So you have to do that here. I'm not concerned for that at the moment because it's happening on the other side of the world, but you're quite right that one day it could happen. And in fact, about 2 years ago I was at a function here when we were discussing media, and there was talk at that time that Amazon were about to buy the rights to the English Premier League, and I think at that time the talk was that they had negotiated the global rights for the game. And I guess if that was to happen, the price here would be you have to be a Prime member. That's, it's what, $100 a year or something. I guess that would have been the arrangement for New Zealand. I kind of don't. I'm not comfortable with global players taking over, because the trouble is if an organisation like Amazon or Google or Microsoft or Apple was to get the rights, if they were to pluck the cherries out of the sporting pie, right? That say in New Zealand that would mean rugby, cricket, league, and soccer, possibly things like yacht racing as well. If they were to pluck those cherries out of the pie, it actually makes it really, really hard for all the other sporting codes. So the ones like netball, which have a huge following in New Zealand but don't really have a big following in most of the world, would struggle. Those sports would really struggle, and they'd be left behind. They'd all be Cinderellas. And Sky would find it really hard to sell a subscription if it only had, the next 17 sports after the big 5 have gone. So I kind of worry about it from that point of view.
Yeah. Well, let's see how it progresses. Now, I see that Brendan McCullum has been added to the commentary team for Spark Sports cricket coverage, which is
well, that's another case. You see, if you want to watch all the cricket, you have to have Spark and Sky Sport. But I'm comfortable with that. I mean, Sky now and Spark Sport together, the 2 subscriptions, I can't remember what they cost. I think it's about $80 a month, but that's still cheaper than it used to be to have the old Sky Sport on satellite service, and it's actually better. I prefer it this way. I'm comfortable with it. I think $80 a month. Well, that's a night at the pub, isn't it? It's it's certainly a trip to the movies for the family is going to cost you more than $80.
Yeah.
By the time you've eaten some popcorn, so it's not a bad price. I mean, it's the problem is it does let people out who don't have that money, and there is a digital divide there.
Oh yeah.
And I'd like to see some way around that, but.
Well, part of that becomes the pub option, right?
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah.
you pay for the alcohol or you pay for the
Yeah.
there's and of course people find other ways around it. Now, on to other things, because we've got quite a few things we were hoping to get through. We're already running short on time. Bill, you had shared online through your blog at billbennett.co.nz some thoughts around this plan coming out of the UK to form an alliance of democratic nations, particularly focused on those involved in the Five Eyes, although New Zealand wasn't mentioned, to create what you referred to as a 5G alternative to Huawei.
Yeah.
Yeah, just run us through what this is and whether you think this can be pulled off, because there are Huawei has competitors already.
Yeah.
And how you might see this playing out. Is it effectively the building of another, basically a direct competitor to Huawei in the network space?
I think that's exactly what the plan is.
Because that's not an easy thing to do. I mean, this has taken, decades really for Huawei to get to where they are in terms of building network equipment and so on.
Time, though,
it's moved quite quickly within
20 years or so,
New Zealand and most markets. But they spent quite a bit of time building up their expertise and profitability in China.
But the company's only 20-something years old, so it's not been around that long. Well, look, this is the issue, right? Is that historically, if you go back, to the netware days, the 90s right? Yeah. There were national champions. So Alcatel would have been the French national champion in the networking space, and there was Northern Telecom. Remember them? I think they were Canadian.
Yep.
So
Nortel,
there were these companies which were national champions in those spaces.
Yeah, that's right.
And over the years they've merged and become. We're down to like 4 or 5 players. Really, the players in the market are Huawei from China, Nokia, which is nominally from Finland, but really is just sort of pan-European American business.
And that's pulled together, about 3 different players now into Nokia. What are they? Nokia Siemens Networks.
That's right. And there was something else as well. And then there's that. But anyway, and
Alcatel,
the other
Lucent.
The other player is Alcatel, which. Oh, sorry, Alcatel is Nokia now. Sorry.
Yeah.
The other one is Ericsson, who's probably wouldn't thank me for saying so, but at the moment they would appear to be third, and Ericsson does not have a major partner in New Zealand at the moment.
And then there's Samsung as well, who are also sort of building up this expertise, right?
Yes, but Samsung created expertise purely as a counter to Huawei. That was the South Korean champion, if you like. So now the thing is Huawei is definitely number one in terms of size. It's probably, it tends to be the cheapest to buy as well, and it's probably, most people would regard it as number one in terms of the technology. To the point that they're a bit ahead of everyone else,
which is incredible to think of how that's moved from a player that was trying to copy and emulate everybody else to where they've got into this very, very strong position in many regards. But of course, we look at the arrest in Canada of their CFO, and we look at all the other sort of things going on, whether they're politically driven or whether they're genuinely driven by security concerns, which is a huge debate. And I think you mentioned in your article we still don't really have the smoking gun that gives a clear picture that says actually these concerns are very clear and very well proven.
The espionage story is the headline story, and that's the one that most people have heard that, and most people understand that and understand why that's important and why one may want to act against Huawei because of that. But there's a second story which we're not told so often, which is that there's also a fear in the West, not so much of espionage, but of not owning a strategic technology which is controlled by a company in a nation which, if not hostile now, potentially could be hostile in the future. I mean, you wouldn't want... I mean, should the tensions between China and, say, America ratchet up, and they're already, quite intense, should that ratchet up, we may find that our networks can't be repaired, or we can't be updated, or they might stop working for some reason, and your call to Huawei support isn't answered because they're in Beijing behind some kind of military firewall or something. So there's all kinds of issues about, can we rely on having a partner looking after our strategic networks that's in a potentially hostile country. Now, those questions they're not questions for tech people like us to answer. That's for that's another person's problem. But those are the issues which are behind this. Now, the problem with the British plan to form an alliance against Huawei is three things really. One is it ratchets it up. Any tension that exists is going to be more so if you're saying, well, actually we're now more or less on a war footing over telecommunications.
Well, it's putting petrol on the fire, and increasing the level of conflict and mistrust.
Yeah, and it's only going to make things worse in that regard. But the other thing is you have to pick a champion, and your champion choices for those Western allies at the moment are Nokia and Ericsson. Now, the problem I see is that the whole reason why telecommunications has advanced at a cracking pace for the last 20 years is because there's solid competition between real competitors duking it out to make great equipment.
Agreed.
And if you don't need to compete, you're going to get those government contracts. Your money's going to come through for you and your shareholders, whether you do a good job or not. You're going to be right back at square one, and there's no need for you to innovate. There's no need for you to do any of those things. If the West were to say, well, we'll have this group of companies, which is Nokia and Ericsson, maybe Samsung. There are a couple of other players as well who are playing parts of that space. If you say we're going to put some money into these and we're going to let them compete and so on, well, that's a better model. But I'm still not convinced that political decision makers should be choosing which.
Very hard to
equipment.
Get it to come out in a manner that works well for everyone.
Yeah.
That said, we also don't want to be in the position where we're stuck, and it's already challenging as it is today. And of course, the talk is that that ties in with this is that the UK, even though they'd made a decision, they said there can be some Huawei within their 5G networks, are potentially actually going to say, no, you've got to get rid of that.
Yeah, and there's all kinds of issues in the UK. I mean, it's the Tory party backbenchers revolting over the issue. There's a huge amount of pressure on the UK from the Americans if they want a trade deal as they pull out of Europe.
We need to start a political podcast, Bill.
Exactly.
There's so many discussions in all
and they're not
different
really,
areas.
That's kind of beyond the scope of our discussion. But what it tells you is that this area of technology has been taken out of the technology zone, if you like, and thrust into the political zone. And New Zealand, we're a small country. If that goes ahead, we're not going to have a lot of choice about how we deal with that. We're going to be, one way or another, we're going to have to choose one of those two camps to be in.
Yeah.
And that means we're not necessarily going to get the best telecommunications. We're going to get the ones that is the politically expedient decision. So, it's not a place we want to be, but we're there.
Yeah, yeah. Now, there was a feel-good story that I meant to cover on the podcast a couple of weeks ago. We talked about it before we started, but I'm sort of high 90% sure that we didn't end up discussing it on the podcast, so I wanted to include it. And this one was shared on LinkedIn here, and is to do with a phone that was lost at Kari Kari Beach. It was shared by Greg Ward. And I'll read out his post. It's fair to say my iPhone 8 has passed the test for water resistance. The near-new device was lost just metres from the waves at Kari Kari Beach. It was eventually found by a couple walking out on the sand. They spotted the smartphone lying in shallow water more than 14 months after it was dropped at the same spot. Weeks later, when they tried to charge it, my contact details appeared on the screen. I connected my iPhone last week. The device for now works perfectly despite being submerged by daily high tides. It was at the beach for more than 420 days. The last call I made was 31st of December 2018. I'm sure Apple will be pretty pleased with a story like that. And look, this is another thing that's tied to the innovation from a technology standpoint. These nano coatings that have become the norm on so many smartphones today. The iPhone 8 was the first iPhone to actually have a level of that. But I think they're rated for maybe half an hour underwater. Obviously, this is not it's not deep water. It hasn't been way out in the ocean. Looked as though it hadn't really.
I don't know. Tide
moved
comes
much.
in. It could be come in.
Oh yeah, maybe. But it's still a pretty pleasing story to hear. And Bill, when we were chatting before the show, you said, well, the story here isn't just about it being waterproof. It's that the phone came up once it was charged with the owner's details,
Yes.
which is something that I guess a lot of us may not realise that our phones are actually able to be set up like that and able to do that when they're lost.
Well, that's actually right. I mean, I was thinking, well, this is a good story. This is a great story, and it's a good story for Apple. But my word, to think that your phone can go missing for 18 months. Under those conditions, and that someone can still find you, that's quite remarkable.
Yeah.
And it just goes to tell you how good that technology is for doing that.
Very, very encouraging. All right, now we'll squeeze in a couple more things before we finish up. There was an announcement from. There was the quarterly report that came through from Crown Infrastructure Bill, and you also wrote something up around their report. And of course, the news from their front on the move to ultra-fast broadband, and of course they're also involved in the rural broadband initiative. The news tends to be pretty good on that front. What was sort of the highlight for you?
This is at the end of March, so it's just as we were going into lockdown. They were starting to prepare for it. I've got the numbers here. 966,773 homes were connected. It's a very precise number, isn't it? To the UFB network. Well, that's thick end of a million. We're closing in on a million. I should imagine. Some 17,000 were added in the quarter, so at that rate we'll probably hit the million number by Christmas this year, which is 1 million people on fibre. At the end of March, it was 58% uptake on the fibre network, which
and that's connections, isn't it? So
it could be a whole get it who had it.
A whole household.
Yeah, but remember that some of those households would only have been connected in recent times. So that means that potentially, I can see that looks like the uptake level's probably going to top out at better than 66%, better than 2/3. But probably, unless something else happens, not a lot better than 2/3. Except that something else did happen in the last couple of months, and a lot more people are working from home. Which I spoke to a number of the ISPs who had a huge backlog of new orders. Earlier today I spoke to the CEO of Farmside, which is the rural ISP, which is actually part of Vodafone now. And Farmside said that their orders, the number of new orders, ran at 300% of normal level in recent months, and they've now hit 15,000, which isn't very big when you compare it with the Vodafones and Sparks and so on, but it's still quite a large number in terms of rural New Zealand. So the uptake of all forms of broadband is actually way ahead of what people thought when these things were being bought. But then, of course, things have changed a lot in the last 12 years.
Well, yeah, certainly the working from home thing. If I look at, for my team at Gorilla Technology, dealing with hundreds of people who, in the past, you would be talking to them, they would be based out of an office, we had control of that infrastructure. Suddenly we're dealing with people we have no, really very, very little impact on their infrastructure. But we are suddenly able to have more because we're getting the feedback, this isn't working too well, etc., etc. And so where there's the fixed wireless broadband that a percentage of the population has been using, and that's been growing because it's certainly more profitable. It's quicker to get up and running in a lot of cases. That was starting to hit some of its limits, right?
Yeah.
The idea of having uncapped, not really practical, still in that space, right?
You have to really carefully manage the traffic on fixed wireless because it's just shared bandwidth.
That's it.
And the telcos had done a really good job of that up until, well, actually, there's two types of fixed wireless in New Zealand, right? In fact, it's 3 types, but there's 2 types that you'll counter most often. The first type is what, for the want of a better term, is urban fixed wireless, and that is basically when you're within sight of a tower, and so you could have urban style fixed wireless and be in the WAPs, but it's when you're inside of a tower. That's pretty good. That runs pretty fast. The speeds are good. The reliability is good, and most of the time that's excellent. But of course, during the lockdown, they were running up against the caps. Were just people just because the caps were open and people could download as much data as they want. The towers were maxing out at some of the time. The second tier is when you're on a RBI tower, but you're out of sight of the tower. You're a bit further away.
This is the rural broadband scenarios.
Yeah, the more rural RBI.
Yeah.
It's the second level of RBI, and that's not so good because the speeds aren't as high, and it's a bit like the equivalent. It's the wireless equivalent of being more than 2 kilometres from an exchange where your VDSL speeds start to drop off and so on. Same sort of thing, really, and that's not so good, but that's still it's still reasonably okay. And then of course there's the WISPs, the guys who run sort of towers and poles,
Wi-Fi distribution.
And they run it up valleys and things
properties.
into the WAPs, and most of those customers are reasonably satisfied. So that's the other thing, is that with the exception of the people on the more rural RBI, most of the customers are reporting, they had a really, reasonably good experience. And the RBI, I mean, I think it's this week that the 100th RBI tower will go up. So that's been, quite something too. And then there's the Rural Connectivity Group, which is filling in the gaps again. So by the end of 2022, we'll have 85% of the population on fibre, and probably
with access to it.
Yeah, with access to fibre. Yeah, sorry, not actually using it, but on the network, just not necessarily connected. And probably about another 12 to 13% will have fixed wireless. So that probably leaves 1 or 2% at the end who may have to use something like satellite if they're going to have anything at all. And all of those technologies have improved enormously in the last 10 years. But there's definitely a bit of a gap between satisfaction with people in the rural areas who can't get unlimited downloads, who can't watch Netflix at peak times. Jason from Farmside was telling me this morning that what they've been encouraging their people to do is to pre-download content during the off-peak periods at night, so that if you want to download a TV series on Netflix, do it at night. Download it to
You can download it to to the app on a smartphone.
Yeah.
You can't do that on
a TV.
On a TV, no. Probably Apple TV and so on. I don't think that. Well, actually, Apple TV, I've not looked for that option. There is a fair chunk of storage in the Apple TV, but I'm not sure that that's there. But certainly, you can take it down onto an Android or an iOS device, and then push it up to your TV or through a box. Yeah.
Well, it's been a relatively good story with. I mean, basically the whole New Zealand broadband story is a big picture thing. Has been very good, and I still hear regularly from Australian friends who just look at us with envy at how good it is.
I think it's been something of a nightmare. People have just coped with it when they've been under lockdown. In Australia and other places around the world where their connectivity's not so good. Obviously, there's still more work to be done, and that will continue. But I think the other thing I saw in the report is there seemed to be sort of slightly ahead. When I saw that somewhere. Slightly ahead of target.
Yeah,
so
a couple of months ahead.
So they're doing well, and I mean it's a whole
the
mix of providers that
faster plans as well. People have been you can I think you can still buy a 30 megabit per second fiber plan with some companies, but no one is anymore. I mean, pretty much 100 is the standard, and the number of people that are getting gigabit plans is going up very fast. That's the fastest growing segment. So, again, that's really quite something.
Very, very encouraging, and look, long may we continue to improve where there are shortcomings in our technology infrastructure in New Zealand, but this is one area where the value of it has really been shown during this period of COVID-19, and it's just so pleasing how good it was for such a good chunk of the population.
Yeah, my guess on this is that once we get to the end of the RBI2 and UFB2, which is the end of 2022, once we get to that point, I think there will still be places that will get filled in. After that, it's just that the pace of filling in new areas will slow. But I would say probably 5 to 6 years from then, most of the country is going to have really fast broadband.
And the great thing when we take that longer term view with fibre is that can keep getting faster and faster, right? So if we decide you need to get 100 gigabit to someone's house because that's what's required, or a business needs, whatever that number may be, and I don't know. I mean, we can look back and we can see, as I've mentioned before, I think that our connectivity to the internet today is about 1 million times as fast as what it was when I finished high school. Yeah. So we are going to come up with ways in which we will use more bandwidth.
The record at the moment across fibre is 4.2 terabits per second. Right, that's the fastest, and that's probably going to be commercially available in about 5 years. Well, I can't think of an app that uses a whole gigabit, but 4.2 terabits.
Well, I guess we have to have that very fast connectivity to link, a country to another country, and those sorts of things. So the better they get with that, the less sort of rebuilding we have to do of connections between one country and another, and they can update bits and pieces without having to rip it all
like
out.
A data center, or if you've got a telescope or a Large Hadron Collider or something, ideal.
Yeah. The other thing, and there's probably a whole lot of discussion we could have into this. Rob O'Neill covered it in Reseller News, was Vodafone partnering with CoreView. Now, this is a US company who have a software product that cloud-based that allows organisations to manage, generate alerts, look for security issues with Microsoft products, 365, and other software as a service subscriptions that they have. And to me, this is a reflection of the new Vodafone New Zealand, which is going through a transition.
Yeah, is it ever? I mean, and the person who's running this part of the business is Lindsay Swart, who Jason Paris recruited Lindsay. Lindsay used to run Azure for Microsoft in the US, so she knows this space. The thing about Vodafone's always had, or for a long time now, it's had an enterprise business. But it tends to be quietly in the background a lot of the time. You don't tend to hear too much from.
Not as visible as what Spark do, for instance, where it's so clear that selling technology services and not just telecommunication services is a huge part of their business.
Well, but you see, what's happened with Vodafone is Vodafone got in early with 5G, and whatever people tell you on the media and so on, 5G is really an enterprise play, and Vodafone is actually pushing into that enterprise space in all kinds of ways. I think it's actually although this particular deal isn't likely to be huge in terms of its impact,
I agree.
It is huge in terms of what it tells you what's going on with Vodafone. And Vodafone is becoming what the Americans call a soup-to-nuts technology company here in New Zealand.
Not a term you hear in New Zealand very often. I don't think we know what it means.
Well, it means to do everything.
Look, CoreView, I don't know too much about them, but there is something smart in that. My understanding is it's an exclusive relationship.
Yeah.
So this is a company that's on the rise.
Yep.
And becomes relevant to a lot of businesses. Suddenly, if you want to use use their particular offering, then you have to go to Vodafone. Of course, there are competitors in the space, but I'm sure it's something that will play out well for both parties.
Yeah, and you'll be buying other stuff from Voda as well. I'm sure of it. One of the things that CoreView does is it'll audit your licenses, your Microsoft licenses, and it'll say you've got far too many of this license, but actually your people need some of that license, and what it does, it optimizes your spending. And the boast, whether it's how tech companies like to boast a bit.
There was a boast which I certainly didn't buy into around. I think that they quoted some figures of people buy X amount of whatever licenses at work and they're basically saying you're only using half of kind of what you've got. When you break it down, and I mean, let's just choose an example. An organisation has Microsoft 365 subscriptions. Yes, not everybody needs everything, but also you tend to buy it in packages. But look, if it can come along and save you 10% of your subscription, it doesn't have to be a big percentage to actually pay for a tool like that, right?
Exactly.
So,
and that's it's just smart business. It's smart business from Vodafone. And when it comes, I was at a Vodafone presentation towards the end of last year about 5G and the transition, and I was actually impressed at how much that company understood enterprise needs, perhaps better than it had done in the past. I think that's not fair, actually. I think it was actually good at that in the past. It just didn't tell us. But now they're telling us, so good.
Oh, well, it keeps the competition in the market locally, and I'm very curious to see what these next couple of years will hold in this transformation that Vodafone have been going through.
I think they're going to hold Spark's feet to the fire, and we were talking about competition earlier, but I think there's that's going to rack up to a whole new level of competition. I mean, the thing about Jason Paris, he comes from Spark, so he knows where the bodies are buried. He knows
the bodies are buried.
He knows the weak spots. He knows he knows how to compete with Spark.
Yeah.
And he's doing it. I mean, that's his game, and it's good for Spark, it's good for Vodafone, it's good for the customers.
Well, we'll be hearing. We have Spark coming on the show in the next few weeks, so it's going to be great to hear a little bit from them about where they're going and 5G and IoT, those sort of areas. So we'll get a bit more insight from their side. And look, it's a real privilege for us as New Zealand Tech Podcast to have such strong support from the big players in the industry, having Spark and Vodafone, who are very much technology companies as well as telecommunications companies, standing behind the show, and we will continue to bag them where it's appropriate. We'll always share our genuine thoughts and opinions. But yeah, it's exciting to see change and to see things sort of stirred up, and that's really how business has to be, doesn't it? And in the world that we're in, technology has really helped speed up business. Not that business hasn't always moved at a pace, but it makes things move even faster. And those that don't move fast enough and get it right end up falling by the wayside. Well, I think that's us for this week. There was maybe one more topic which we might squeeze in next week if appropriate, but I think we've covered a lot of bases there, Bill. So thank you very much for joining the show.
Oh, you're welcome, Paul.
And we'll look forward to catching up again soon. Now, just as a reminder for people, in terms of catching up with your content, you write for a whole range of media, but you've also got your blog, which is a great place for content.
Yeah, billbennett.co.nz, and I've been putting more up there recently because, generally speaking, there's a correlation between how much time I got to write on the blog and how much time I got to work with everyone else. There's been a little bit of time on my hands over the last 6 weeks, but that's changing again now, of course.
Good. Yeah. Well, I hope it ramps up fully, but not so much that it destroys you, Bill, because I know sometimes you get incredibly busy, and then we miss out having you on the show as well. And in fact, I must say that one of the things that I would thank our partners for with the show is that we as much as we can. It probably hasn't been quite as often as I'd like. We're starting to have our tech journalists on the show a little bit more regularly because we're able to afford to reward you in a very small way, but it's hopefully that twists your arm a little bit more often to make it onto the show. So
yeah.
At least we're doing our part to a degree, and not just stealing some of your time without saying thank you. So thank you, and look, you've been a supporter of the New Zealand Tech Podcast and on the show for I couldn't count how many years, Bill, and we've 6, very much appreciated probably 7 or 8.
Yeah, could be. Yeah.
So thank you. It is really appreciated, and it certainly is my goal that we continue to have you on the show. And look, it's to a degree a pity there isn't as as much of a community of technology journalists in New Zealand as there once was. The playing field has changed, but when you're able to give your time and come on the show, I think you always bring some incredible insights. So
different insights, I would say.
Well, thank you for that. And hey, thanks everybody for listening in. We'll be back again next week. And we've got some other great guests lined up over the weeks ahead. And we're closing in on episode 500, which
I want to be here for that one.
Should hit in less than around 2 months' time. So
put me in.
We need to have a little bit of a celebration show for that. And thanks everyone.
Cheers.
Catch you soon. And again, thanks to our show partners too. All right. Cheers.